in Conversation event with the wonderful actress and recent Golden Globe nominee. Again, actually, she was nominated for TV acting already for her work on Outlander, but yesterday was nominated for Belfast. It is, of course, the wonderful Caitríona Balfe. We're delighted to have her join us today, and she will be in discussion with the Academy Chief Executive, Anya Moriarty. I'll do a proper introduction to Caitríona shortly, but I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping first. Firstly, thank you all for joining us. Please do ask some questions. We've had some great questions throughout the year. Put me to shame on some of the ones I was doing. The questions from the audience were fantastic. So please do keep them coming in through the event, and we'll keep an eye on them, and Anya will be sure to get to them and ask as many as she can to Caitríona at the end. Secondly, if you like what you're seeing, and I'm sure you will, please do take a screen grab and share on your social media platform of choice. You can do that and use the hashtag IFTA. And please do share. Thank you very much. Again, the Q&A button is at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on what format you're using. We'll go for about 90 minutes in total. That is including Q&A portion. So that's the maximum there. So we'll probably go for about 60, 70 minutes interview and then take some questions. So without further ado, we're delighted to welcome Caitríona Balfe. She's an Irish actress from Monaghan originally. A small town who we just tried to pronounce and I would have failed miserably, so we're just going to say Monaghan. She's just, as I mentioned, been nominated for a Golden Globe for her wonderful performance in Kenneth Branagh's Belfast. She's also appeared in films such as Super 8, Now You See Me, and alongside Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and 50 Cent in Escape Plan, which must have been surreal, and I'm sure we're going to have some questions about that. She's perhaps best known for playing Claire Randall in Outlander on Starz Network in the US. It's based on the novels by Diana Gabaldon, and hugely popular show, earning her legions of fans, and it's just about to embark on a 7th season, I believe, and it's been absolutely nothing short of a phenomenon. Also, recently, she starred opposite Matt Damon and Christian Bale in Ford vs. Ferrari, which is a terrific film, and Money Monster from Jodie Foster. As I mentioned, we will see her again very soon in Belfast, which will be hitting Irish big screens early next year, and for which she's quite rightly earning rave reviews. We're absolutely delighted to have her here today, so I'm going to pass it over to the Academy Chief Executive, Anya Moriarty, who's going to be your very capable host today. Anya, you're very welcome, and Caitríona, thank you so much. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Hi, Caitríona. You're very, very welcome.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for taking the time to join us. I know it's a busy run for you right now, so we really appreciate it. And especially the young actors and filmmakers in the Academy and so forth, they were just absolutely thrilled that you would take the time right now. And so look, you're very, very welcome indeed.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure.
So look, Gar gave a fantastic introduction there. I don't know if there's much more for me to say right now, but so I'll get straight into the questions overall in terms of, you know, as he said, you're from a small town in County Monaghan, you know, the bordering Northern Ireland, which comes into play later on when we talk about Belfast and so forth. But let's go back to the beginning. Most people want to know, you know, how you started out and so forth. And it was your decision, you know, when you were leaving school, even though you didn't watch much TV because it mightn't have been allowed in your house with your dad and so forth, and there was no cinema in your small town and so forth, you decided to study acting and you went up to DIT in Dublin and started acting there. So why did you choose acting out of the blue like that? Was it something that you were passionate about?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was out of the blue. I mean, I'd been involved in youth theatre in Monaghan since I was probably about 7. I think my first ever role was we did a very small production of Oliver and I played Mr. Bumble because I was very tall. But yeah, you know, throughout school, I was always involved in youth dramatics and did plays and stuff like that. And so when it came to doing my leaving cert, that was always my first choice, was to go and study drama. You know, it took a little bit of kind of talking to the parents and making them sort of think it was an okay thing to go and study. But yeah, I went to DIT, which was incredible. And, you know, I remember going for those first auditions before getting into it, and it was just such a I don't know, it was such a dream come true. I guess when I was a kid, it was just the thing that I'd always, I remember seeing Fame and stuff like that, where it was all the drama kids in New York and they all sit around dancing and singing and stuff. It wasn't quite like that, but in my head, that was sort of, I guess, what it was going to be like, this kind of really fun experience where everybody just, yeah, just emotes all the time, I suppose.
Fantastic. So you must have been thrilled then, obviously, to get that place. And were you long? Because I know that you were there for within your
Year.
first year. Was it a year?
I finished my year, yeah.
You finished the first year, and then you were, well, you see, you were always very tall and, dare I say, very, very beautiful, which I know you have a problem saying that, but you were striking when you were young because of your height and so forth. So you were approached by a scout looking and saw you as a potential model, and so tell us a little bit about that. Obviously, you were picked up to join the model agency, and then you went on to Paris very quickly. You decided, look, I'll make a go of it, and you went to Paris. But just tell us a little bit about that in terms of modeling at the time.
Yeah, well, when I was studying in DIT, I loved it, but I also think I wouldn't say that I had a very sheltered upbringing, but we didn't really travel very much, or we didn't, it was a big family, and, we didn't have a huge amount of money. So I think I was very much, that first sort of let out of, that first vestiges of freedom, and being in Dublin for the first time. And I definitely don't think I was mature enough to be studying at that time. When I look back on it, I definitely was the one who was probably sleeping in a lot, maybe not making all of my classes. And even though I loved it, it just wasn't, I don't know, I wasn't clicking with it for some reason. And one day, we were a couple of us who were in our drama school. We were somebody had put a sign up in our rec room, and they were like, we could make a couple of pounds an hour to go and do some charity work and pack bags. So we decided we would do it, as we were broke students, and it was also for a charity that had affected people in my family. So we ended up in the Swan Centre in Rathmines packing bags, and as a model scout was in doing a shopping, and he spotted me and gave me his card and asked if I wanted to come to the office. And I started doing that part-time in Dublin for the last few months of my year. And during that summer, they had sort of said, would you think about doing this permanently? And then a scout came over from Paris, I think a couple of weeks later, and it was sort of the offer was given to go to Paris. And, I remember having to go home to my parents and say, well, that sort of drama course that you weren't too happy about in the first place. Well, I'm thinking of taking a year out and going to Paris. And, I don't think they were best pleased. But at the same time, I was 18, so I was like out the door.
Exactly. And you went for the adventure, but it turned out to be a very successful move for you. And, obviously you went on to work with, the top designers of the era, appearing in leading fashion magazines and doing campaigns for houses like Dolce & Gabbana, Chanel, Givenchy, Calvin Klein, all of those, Louis Vuitton. And I suppose, rather than us, because obviously we want to get on to the acting, which is the fantastic part of and most successful part of your later career, is what were your learnings that you brought away from that period, in terms of your whole experience, in terms of your personal growth, your confidence, the skills that you learned, because I'm sure there was ups and downs in a life like that, but so the skills that you took away with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a word you said. I really did go for the adventure, and it was, I had there's such an education I think you get from travel and from meeting people from all over the world. And I think that's the best thing that I was given from that that time period that I spent in that industry, I think you learn so much about yourself and about people and about humanity just from traveling and from immersing yourself in different cultures and meeting people from different walks of life. One thing people, I think, can be quite dismissive and look down on models, but in general, these are young women from all over the world who, are just trying to, have a better life for themselves or their families a lot of the time. And you really do kind of get a glimpse into all these other cultures and all these other kind of experiences. And it was a huge, I don't know, a huge life lesson for me, all of that. And also, I think there's a couple of things. I think obviously the two industries are very different. There are overlaps and stuff like that. But, whereas the downside of modeling, for me at least, or what is not sort of the healthiest thing, is that you become so focused on the exterior and sort of this 2D image that you have to present. So everything's always about how you're presenting yourself, and where that can give you certain lessons in poise and things like that, it also is quite I suppose it's not just the healthiest way of sort of thinking about yourself and carrying yourself through life, and I think especially when you move into acting, if you're in any way thinking of that, then you're not in a scene and you're not immersing yourself in a character or in the circumstances. So, I think one of the things you sort of maybe learn as a model that you can take into acting is that you always know where your light is. And that's kind of a subconscious thing. But I think more what I had to do when I moved from modeling into acting was unlearn a lot of bad habits. And I think that's, one of the things that was really good, that I gave myself the time to sort of take and study when I did move to LA, and take some time off, to sort of forget about that exterior and forget about thinking about, what it looks like and what people see, rather than what you're feeling or what you're kind of emoting and showing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, um, you spent about 10 years, we'll say, maybe 9, 10 years, obviously, in that. But around about 2008, you started back. You kind of had the bug again. You kind of felt acting was still there in the back of your head, and you started taking up, when you were based in New York at that stage, and you took up some acting classes, and just got a feel for it again. And was acting always in the back of your mind? And tell us a little bit about what you learned in those acting classes, and were there any standout lessons, and how it convinced you that this was what you wanted to do with your life?
Yeah, well, I mean, acting was always, I knew that I was always wanted to go back to it. I think, I'd never intended to stay in fashion that long. And sometimes you get stuck in something and you're not quite sure how to move out of it, or what the steps are that you need to take to move out of it. So, like you said, I started doing some drop-in classes in New York, which I'm not sure that I learned a huge amount. It's, some of them, I was thinking about one of them the other day. It's a company, it was called Black Nexus. And, it was just this sort of, I mean, it was great because it was a drop-in class. You could just go in, but it was I think it was your typical sort of, if there was a TV show that showed this like really overwrought and far too many people being like far too emotional in a room.
Yes.
It was one of these things. But what it did do was it sort of did show me that I still had the passion for it, and I still was hungry enough for it. But again, it was sort of like I did some of those, and then I did a course at, there's a place called New York Film Academy, and it was just sort of, I think I was just giving myself little things step by step to sort of build up my own confidence. And I think when you make a big life change, sometimes you just have to steady yourself for it and prepare yourself. So those were all kind of steps I was taking. And then I sort of took the plunge and moved to LA then without really much of a plan, but just sort of was like, right, I think I was 29 and I sort of felt, well, if I don't do it now, I never will, and I'll be too old and then I'll, regret it for the rest of my life. So
Fantastic. But I'm sure were people saying that you were mad, because obviously thousands of actors go to LA, to make it big, and unfortunately there's not room for everybody, so it was a big risk in a sense.
yeah, it was. I remember a friend of mine, a good friend of mine from Dublin, Donal, who lives in New York, or lived in New York at the time, and he and I guess there was another acting class. I mean, I can't remember how many, you sort of like stick yourself in, but they did this thing where it was like you go to LA and you did a couple of days, working with an acting coach, and then you did a showcase and a couple of agents and stuff come to see. And I remember that neither of us could drive. And so the two of us used to cycle to this class every day, which, you wouldn't see anybody on a bike in LA. And we trying to cross these like roads that just had like multiple lanes, and the two of us on our little bikes. But I remember one agent sort of said he'd take a meeting with me, and, and I think they just sort of do that just because they have to, and they probably get paid to go see these showcases anyway. But he was asking me questions, and I had sort of, I don't know, I just had this sort of, I don't know whether it was a confidence, because I still really wasn't, but I just had this feeling that this is what I love to do. So it has to work out, So I took the meeting with him, and I think I was very cocky in it. He was like, so do you think you have that? I was like, yes, I do. I think I can do this.
Good for you. Excellent. And I think that's the important thing for young actors and young filmmakers, watching in today, just to have that leap of faith, and to know intrinsically, this is what I want to do, and I have to have the confidence to do it. But obviously for you, tell them a little bit about what moves you made to try and get yourself noticed in LA at the beginning. So did you get an official agent at that stage, or did you have to tout yourself around, or what did you do?
Yeah, but one thing I will say, just what you're saying about young actors or filmmakers or whatever, the one thing, and I can't remember who said this to me, but somebody at one point said to me, the difference between people who are successful and people who aren't is not that the people who are successful are so much better or have such a better knowledge of things. It's that they just do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that you have to just, and I think as Irish people as well, sometimes we can suffer from this kind of, I don't know, national lack of confidence in a weird way or something. We're sort of like, we won't do that, and we won't sort of like be too brash or but I think sometimes you just have to go forward, and a lot of the time, like when I went to LA, I really didn't know how I was going to get anywhere or do anything. And the first thing I remember, I read an article about Amy Adams, and she was talking about her acting coach that she worked with all the time. And so I looked up her acting coach, and I discovered that her acting coach's class was within walking distance, which was great because I still wasn't driving. And I started going to that acting class. And then, another acting class somebody suggested, and I started going to that. And through that, one teacher, one of my coaches, she suggested me to a manager, because I'd been working with her for a while. And, and that was the other thing. I was working really hard. I was always prepared. I was always, I had sort of made this big decision. So I wasn't going to kind of like show up to class and not know my stuff or not rehearse with my partner and all those things. But anyway, so she had suggested me to a manager, and that was the first representation I got then. But, there's websites you can sign up to, right? I think in the UK it's Spotlight, but in the US it was another one, Breakdowns. And so you can get a link. There's sort of the open link, but if you sort of find somebody in the industry who's got an in, you could get the professional link, and then you find out about the auditions and you can self-submit and all of those things. And I did student films. I was looking on Backstage. I did some dodgy, like, but it was all in the, all in the pursuit of getting experience. And also, you never know where the next connection is going to come. When I started working with this one acting teacher, Judith Weston, who's amazing, and her books on acting and directing actors, because she works not only with actors, she works a lot with directors, and she's worked with Ava DuVernay and the Russo brothers, and so many amazing people. But when I started working with her class sort of changed my life, because that was the first time I was in a classroom where it wasn't just a bunch of actors that were sort of all wanting to get a part and none of us knew how. Yeah. She brought together people who were already in the industry. So it was like writers, people who were doing special effects, or people who were first ADs or things like that, but wanted to go direct their first film. So they were working with her as directors, but she would put us all together and pair us off. So you would constantly be working on material with somebody who was already in the business and who was already sort of in that directing sphere. And so that was a very different process, because that was the most like a work environment, but it also put you in touch with people that I think as an actor, sometimes you put on a pedestal, and you sort of think of like, oh, well, they're the director and I can't, and all of a sudden you're all in a learning environment together. So it was great. And I got my first jobs out of that class because people I worked with put me up for things or suggested me for things. And, it was, that was sort of the start.
Which was great. And it just shows that, you were prepared to put in the work. You didn't just go there and hope, you got stuck in and you mixed around and so forth. And obviously in 2011, then you got your big break. You got the role in Super 8, J.J. Abrams' film, and he also helped you get a work permit, as far as I understand. But what was the casting process like? Obviously, you'd worked with all of these, young filmmakers and trying to find your way. And but what was when you got down to it then with somebody like J.J. Abrams? What was the casting process like for Super 8? And what did you learn from that experience?
Well, I remember that casting was a very strange one, because I had to go in and it was all improv. I mean, obviously, if people have seen the movie, I have 0 lines in the film, but it was a very good first, whatever, it's, I played the dead mom. I don't say anything, but, so and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name. That's terrible. The casting director, she's so lovely. But I had to go in and it was just an improv, and I had to play with a kid in a park and sort of just do this improv in a room. And, it was very fun, and you just sort of go for it. And, very strangely, they were like, yeah, JJ would love to have you for this role. And then the issue was I didn't quite have the right work visa. I had to still on a fashion visa, and I needed an acting visa. And they sort of offered to kind of sponsor it in a way, which is unheard of because my role was non-existent. But at that time, I had done enough sort of commercials and things to get SAG eligible, because that's the other big thing. If you're in the US, you have to be part of the union to get these jobs too. So I had that under my belt. But yeah, I'll be forever indebted to them for that, because that really saved me for quite a few, I think that was like a 3-year visa I got then because of them.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And again, for some of the younger people, kind of young actors listening in, in terms of, obviously the big thing is when people do auditions, and it's the sense of not getting the part certain times. And for you too, were you in that whole process of doing a lot of auditions, not quite getting there, and dealing with rejection in a sense? And so do you have any advice for young actors who have to just get through that period?
Oh God. You know, the one thing I would wish for every young actor is to be able to sit on the other side of the audition process, which I've been fortunate enough to do now a few times, mainly through Outlander, because it's so it's such a painful process sometimes. It can also be an amazing process. You know, you actually get to work on something, you get to bring it in, you get to present your work. My one big thing was be off book, know your material, you know, so that when you're in that room, if the casting director asks you to do it this way or that way or shifts it up, then you're not locked into looking down at your page. You're free and you're able to kind of just, you know, do whatever they want. But, you know, 9 times out of 10, you will do a great job, but you just might not be right for the role. And that's the thing. It's not you, it's not your talent, it's not, you know, the work that you've put in. It's an essence that just might not be there, that doesn't match the character. And, you know, so often, you know, I've been part of the process for other characters in Outlander when I've been able to, you know, sit in on these auditions, and people will come in and they'll do the most amazing work, but they just don't feel like that character. And so it can be, you know, it's hard to explain to somebody who's really trying hard, and, you know, how do you change that? You can't, you know, it's out of your control. And I think that you have to allow yourself to be okay with that, you know, that it's, you're not going to be able to control certain elements of things. What you can control is your work, and, you know, how much you prepare, being, you know, off book, being on time, you know, if it's the car. And I always think it's, you know, people need a little help with their imagination as well. I think, you know, we would think that, you know, casting directors and directors and all of that, they can see you as a blank canvas and they can imagine you in any scenario. But without going in full costume to an audition, I think it's best to give a subtle nod to something that, you know, if you're doing a period piece, you don't have to go in period costume, because then that looks maybe a little, but wear something that sort of gives a vibe of that period, or those kind of things. I don't know. It's just such a, it can be
Right.
such a painful process. And I, you know, many times I've walked out of auditions crying, sat in my car, tears, you
Well,
know.
well, you see, this is all good to know in terms of, and it seems to be the journey that most actors have to go through, and thankfully you come out the other side. But for you, obviously, yes, you did a few more smaller parts like that before landing the big one, your first major role, which was in Outlander in 2014. So, you know, obviously there was a couple of years of hard work, and then it happened for you, and it was based on, obviously, Outlander, based on the book by Diana Gabald, and your character Claire Randall is a time traveler and World War II nurse, and she's playing opposite Sam Hewn. Is that how you pronounce that name?
Yeah,
Hewn?
I'm feeling.
Yeah, playing Jamie, your partner and later your husband, and all of that. So just when you're talking about casting directors there, in a sense, if you think about the casting directors at the time for Outlander, yes, they thought you fit the part, but they needed to do a chemistry test for you with Sam Hewn, and so what was that like? That was a whole different, you know, ball game now, in terms of knowing that you're right for the part, but obviously it's down to how you fit on screen, because obviously the whole drama hangs around these two characters. So that was really important. And so what was that test like? And was the creator, you know, the legendary showrunner Ronald Moore, was he in the room at the
No,
time?
Ron wasn't in the room, but Meryl Davis, who's one of our executive producers, was there, and Ira Bear, who was one of our original writers. It's funny, that test, I broke one of my own rules. I remember I was running late because there was all this
Oh,
traffic works on, or there was road works on Washington, and it was in Culver City. So I remember I was, yeah, just so frustrated trying to get to the place on time, you know, and I was stuck in this bloody roadworks. And so I arrived in and I was like sweaty, and which in a way it didn't give me time to be nervous about, because I think if I was sitting outside the room and thinking about what I'm going to do and all of that, sometimes, you get too nervous. But so I sort of like breezed into the room and was like trying to pat myself down with tissue because I was just so sweaty. But yeah, I mean, that was a really amazing, audition process, because Sam is obviously, now I know this, but he's just one of the nicest guys, and he was just such a like calm influence in the room, and he was just sort of standing there, and we started chatting about Scotland. I have a lot of friends who live there and stuff, and we just got into the scene, and we both really went for it. There was one big fight scene that we had to do. And I remember we were so, both of us were so ramped up in this scene, and he grabbed me and I went to sort of move his hand off, and he ended up hitting me in the face. But it was good because our adrenaline was up and we were sort of really in it. I don't recommend ever hitting anyone in an audition, by the way, but I guess he'd already got the part at that point, so he could get away with it.
Fantastic.
But yeah, I don't know, I think you can't, sometimes things, you're just right for it and it just happens. But one thing I did after that have to meet Ron, and it was over the weekend. So maybe I did that on a Thursday and I was meeting Ron on Monday, and I read the book that weekend, which is, over 1,000 pages. I spent doing nothing else but those 3 days reading that book, because I wanted to make sure when I got that meeting that I knew what I was going to be talking about, and I knew the character. So that's one of the things, you have to put in that extra bit of work, I think.
Excellent. Really, really good. And so how did you feel about getting that part, and what did it mean to you overall? Obviously, you had no sense of what it was going to become, really, or did you, in terms of how successful it would be worldwide? And
no, I mean, I had no idea. I think I hadn't worked in probably about 5 months, maybe more, before I got that job. So it was relief. It was relief that I was getting a job. I was going to be able to pay my rent. Um, and it's sort of, you never know with these things. There's you do so many self tapes, you do so many auditions, and that once I'd got the role, which was probably a week after that chemistry read, they had called me on a Monday or something, and they were like, "Can you leave Wednesday?" And I was like, "No, I think I think I have a cat." I was very concerned about my cat. I know that much. I was like, "Can I just have till Friday? I just need a few days to like pack and get myself sorted." So you don't really have a lot of time to think about it. I think, yeah, but I think, as an actor, you sort of have to be ready to just go and do at a moment's notice. Like, I think that's part of we're sort of like, there's gypsy in our blood, I think, a little bit, right?
yeah.
But yeah, and I'm not sure I was even aware how long I was going to be away. I think I thought I was probably going to be away for like 6 or 7 months, but it was a year. So yeah, it was all just a bit like, oh God, I guess I'm trying to find some warm jumpers in my wardrobe.
And so you were based in Glasgow then?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So moved to Glasgow, and that first year of shooting was a full calendar year, and it was probably the most intense year of my life, I think. The first 5 or 6 months as well, we were doing 11-day fortnights, which is a backbreaker.
Yeah.
And I was in 99% of the scenes, I think. I didn't
let up over the 6 years. Yeah, I think
it's let up a little. I mean, that first year is the most, I mean, I'm not quite sure how it happened, but it was exciting. I remember like just the drives to work, and you'd be driving at 5 a.m. in the morning and watching the sunrise, and Scotland's so gorgeous, and there was lots of rainbows. I remember that for some reason in the beginning, and I felt really lucky. I felt really, really privileged. And from the first day of shooting, it sort of, there was a really good ease to it and a rhythm, and it sort of felt like I was like, oh, I actually know how to do this, because I had never done TV. I'd done, a couple of bit parts on films and stuff, but TV is such a different beast.
Yeah.
In the beginning, I hadn't a clue what half of the terminology was, what people's jobs were. It's sort of like, who's that guy? What's that called? Like, but, I was lucky in that my character was also thrown into a very new experience. So I could use my own sort of, uncertainty and put it into the character as well. So it sort of worked out. It was very kismet, I suppose.
Well, that must have been a huge learning curve for you to go from, doing the smaller parts or to doing, short bursts, to be filming those grueling hours over a year. And then when you look at the books as well, I'm like, your character travels through time across, different centuries, and gets drawn into all sorts of action scenes. Your horse riding, it kind of pulled into major battles. There's romance on the screen. You're doing all sorts of things. So you were obviously learning all the time, and you built up a wide range of skills, and that was an incredible learning curve. But did you embrace every learning moment, and what stood out from you from all of that? And did you realize that you were building up these skills and this resilience to becoming an absolutely brilliant actor?
Well, I don't know if you realize things usually. Well, me anyway. I think these things sort of, you look back in hindsight, and you become more aware of it. And at the time, you're sort of just surviving. But I think sometimes people look down on genres like this, but you don't get to do as much in other genres. I mean, I've literally been able to do so much with this character in terms of her aging, different stages in her life, in her personal life, professional life. As you said, there's action, there's, it sort of encompasses so many things, this show. And one of the things is that it's just kept it really, really interesting for me, which is really important, because I think, that keeping it challenging and keeping you on your toes, and I guess constantly learning, is something that's really important to me. But one of the most amazing things I think about this show, the fact that we shot it in the UK, was the incredible actors I got to work with. And that was the biggest learning, moment, or the most education, I think, having not gone to a traditional, or not finished my traditional acting school,
Yeah.
being able to work with people like, Tobias Menzies, Simon Callow, Bill Patterson, all of these great actors we've had. And then in season 2, we had a bunch of amazing French actors like Dominique Perron and Pignon, sorry. Working with people of that caliber, it makes you raise your game. It makes you keeps you on your toes. I think that's been the greatest thing. It's been so lovely to be able to always have great sparring partners. And I think from the very get-go, I was really lucky. My first 2 weeks were with Tobias pretty much exclusively. And Tobias is such an incredible actor. And so he definitely set a tone of the level of where we were going to be at. And, everyone, Gary Lewis and Graham McTavish and Sam, and, it's all of these incredible actors who just every day, we were always trying to elevate everything. What was on the page was great, but it's like, how do we elevate it? How do we keep it, more honest? How do we ground it?
And so were you getting a lot of time to rehearse and to workshop certain elements and all of that? Or were you really, were you?
No, I mean, occasionally we would get some rehearsal, like the day of read through, and usually there's I mean, it's not a lot. Usually there's 2 days between blocks. They try and do it over a weekend. So you get a weekend and 2 days before you start the next two scripts. So sometimes you would have a bit of rehearsal of, if there was a big scene, a big moment or whatever, or some of the more romantic scenes, they have to be sort of blocked out and rehearsed. But there was horse riding rehearsals that we all had to, I mean, as everyone as an actor was like, yeah, we've got loads of horse riding experience, and we all show up and everyone's like, actually, when I said lots of experience, what I meant was I've been on a horse once. But but some of the stuff, like we did have, I mean, I'm trying to remember now. There was some of the stuff with Claire, because of her being a nurse and because of then later on being a doctor, we do have a medical advisor, and sometimes I have rehearsals with her, whether it's, in season 1, I had a 1940s manual from the Second World War that was all about bandaging. And so I had to learn all my different bandages.
Very good.
But yeah, so the little bits of that, but those are always, that's the other thing, you're stealing time at the end of a day, in lunchtime, there's fittings always have to be fit in. It's TV's an intense beast. Yeah.
But what's brilliant is that over the years, and obviously this is you finished your 6th season, which will be coming out next March. You've obviously seen what's happening in front of the camera, behind the camera. You've learned so much, which is something we'll come on to a little bit later on, in terms of your own personal ambition and so forth. But so obviously, yes, so you finished season 6, and you filmed that during lockdown, and so you wound up actually only just doing 8 episodes instead of the kind of traditional 13 episodes because of COVID, and because of the restrictions and so forth. But at the end of the last season, Claire obviously had been physically abused and obviously attacked, and obviously that's something that you then, in this series that you've just filmed, had to deal with, the kind of fallout of that, and Claire grappling with the trauma of this having happened to her. So it was kind of, it really brought your character in a whole new direction, because she's always so strong. She knows her own mind. She's able to make decisions and just do it, whereas this was her falling apart. So that was a new challenge for you. So just tell us a little bit about how you planned for doing that, and did you have to research that in terms of where her head was at, what was going on inside her head, and how you brought that to the characters, so just in terms of planning for it?
Yeah, well, I think Claire is someone, and I think it's partially because she's a doctor, but she's probably a doctor partially because she's able to do this. She's somebody who's very good at compartmentalizing things and being able to, that she's had so much trauma throughout her life, but she's always sort of managed to put it in a box and put it to one side and move ahead. But as you said, the events of the end of last season, those are too much, and it was too horrific for her to be able to use that traditional coping mechanism. So I'm not sure exactly how much I could talk about, because there's all of these, spoiler things, but we do see her unravel this season in a way that she hasn't before. And, a lot of that is, there's research, I like to read psychology. You kind of try and research as much as you can about certain conditions, if you're going to portray them. And also we talked a lot we had Jamie Payne as one of our directors, who directed the last block of season 5. So he would have directed that whole attack and all of that. And then he was there for sort of, I guess, the 2 episodes that are really when this comes to a head, and Claire really has to deal with it. So he and I were very collaborative, talking about how we wanted Claire to, the language, I guess, and sort of the emotional journey that she was going to take. And in terms of like what I do with research, it's a lot of it's a lot of this, sometimes it's, reading the psychology and you get a bit heady with it. So then, most of it is daydreaming, to be honest. You sit and you meditate on things and you think about it and you sort of, you know, go through different scenarios in your own head and you find the one that feels the most true to you and the one that you think is the most connected to her and what her experience is. And, you know, it's that's I mean, that's where I do most of my work, is just sort of sitting and daydreaming and imagining things. That's kind of like our 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 toolbox is in there, really, I suppose.
Yes, well, so it'll be interesting to see all of that unfold now on screen next March. But throughout the filming in Outlander, each of the 6 years, you've been able to, you've been lucky enough to be able to go off and do, a couple of weeks in a feature film, or to do some work like that. So give us, obviously that's every actor's dream, and obviously more so more recently with the parts that you've been able to take on, and still consistently be true to Outlander and be able to do that. Give us a sense of the filming schedule that goes on with Outlander in a normal non-COVID period. When does it normally film, and for what period of time in more recent years?
Yeah, well, I've only done, so Belfast is actually my third film that I've done while filming Outlander, and we've been on Outlander now for 8 years, so it doesn't feel like I've done a lot.
Okay.
But I've been because Outlander is we have one of the longest schedules, I think, of any TV show. We're all constantly scratching our heads going, how does it take us so long? But it varies. We don't have a set schedule. Season 1 took a year, but we took probably about 6 months off between season 1 and season 2. So I did Money Monster in that time, which is great. And then between season 2 and 3, we only really had I think 3 months off or something like that. And we were doing a lot of press for the show. So I actually chose not to do anything at that time. I didn't find anything that sort of really was like, right, I have to do this. And you're so exhausted by the time you finish a season. I always say I would love to do something, but it has to be the really like the right thing, because I don't want to start the next season exhausted and not feel like it was worth it. And between seasons 3 and 4, we didn't really take a break at all. I think it was like maybe 6 weeks, and we spent about 3 of those weeks doing press as well. So that was that. Nothing happened then. And then Ford versus Ferrari was between seasons, I think 4 and 5, which was great. I think we took again maybe 6 months between seasons. And I was just really lucky enough that film came my way and that it happened to slot in the right place.
Yeah.
A lot of it's it's luck. A lot of it, it's like, does it work within the time frame? I've been offered great things sometimes and I can't do it. You have to turn it down because you're not available. But then
let's go to Money Monster even as an example of, obviously, Ford, and you mentioned Ford versus Ferrari, and we'll talk about that as well very briefly before going on to talk about Belfast. But with Money Monster, obviously you got a chance to work with a female director, Jodie Foster, and obviously she's a brilliant director and a brilliant actress. So did her her acting background play a pivotal role in how she directed you, or did you notice that difference, and was it something that you really enjoyed, let's say, as a different approach?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's funny now, I've been directed by 2 director actors, so I do think there is a difference. I think with Jodie, there is just like an immediate shorthand, because she understands what you need, and she, for her to get what she needs, it's a very quick thing for her to be like, look, I need this or need that. And I think, there's definitely, you're not really going to get any result orientated directions from a director actor. I think they're very good at like giving you something that's going to be, this is what I need, so you get there your way, but that's going to be what I need, where you're not going to get a line reading, I guess is what I'm saying, from someone like that. But Jodie was amazing. I mean, again, she's just one of the most intelligent but down to earth. What I loved about that, the minute I got that audition, I think I just researched the hell out of the subject matter, and I think I was taking a flight and I read Michael Lewis's book, Flash Boys, sort of on the flight. So by the time I met her, we had that first meeting and I was able to talk about the subject matter inside out. And I'd read a bunch of articles and I'd done all my research. And I think that matters to people. I think people really appreciate that because they want to know that you're as passionate about the subject and that you're going to put the work in, because they're working really hard and they're not going to be able to hold your hand through a project. They have a million things going on. So they want to know that you're going to show up and be prepared. But yeah, I loved working with her. She's amazing.
Fantastic. And that seems to be something that you really bring to the table, Caitríona, and it stands to you in terms of, and you can hear others talking about that in terms of directors you've worked with, and even Kenneth will talk about that very shortly. But even Ford versus Ferrari, for example, people say that was the performance that made you become noticed in the higher echelons, let's say, of Hollywood. Obviously other people noticed you, but the powers that be, in terms of obviously the film was directed by James Mangold, and a colleague of mine, Gar O'Brien, here at the Academy, he's interviewed Scott Frank, for example, who's written with James and on Logan, and he's also interviewed Donald Sylvester, who won the Oscar for sound on Ford versus Ferrari, and they all sing his praises as a director to work with. So obviously you would have found the same. How was that?
Loved working with Jim. I mean, Jim's kind of he's like bombastic, and he's the sort of director who's like shouting over, but in like the most lovely way. It was a joy to work with him, and it was a joy to see, one of the first things you notice, and because obviously I went into that and I was quite intimidated by who I was going to be working with, and how much trust Christian and Matt had in James or Jim. It's sort of, when you see actors of that caliber trust their director like that, then you know that whatever he asks, you're going to do, because you know that he's going to be looking out for you and he's not going to ask you to do something that's not going to look good or not work. So it was so much fun. I mean, I loved that. It was definitely a boys' club, that film. It was like me and all of the men.
Yes.
But it was great. I love sport films anyway, and I love car racing. So I was sort of in my element.
But the chemistry between you and Christian Bale was just fantastic on screen.
I mean, Christian's amazing.
It was brilliantly subtle and honest and very believable. And a lot of, obviously, what was it like working with Christian? Because, a lot of people know that he's quite a serious actor in terms, he takes it all very serious in terms of his methodology and so forth, and maybe sometimes kind of intense as an actor. So how did you find that? Was that a different setting for you?
I mean, he takes his work seriously. I didn't find him too intense, or, he definitely wasn't difficult at all to work with. I really respect somebody who works really hard. When we first started, I remember our first read through, the poor guy, he had just done Cheney and he was trying to lose all this weight. And I remember myself and Noah Jupe, who plays our son in that, the three of us got together and we were just having a little chat and read through. And myself and Noah were tucking into this like lunch. There was like chicken and stuff like that. And Christian's there eating this tiny little salad. And, we didn't even think about it. But he, I just have so much admiration for him. And for, you look at his roles and his craft and how, I don't know, intense sometimes has a bad connotation, but
it probably does have, but in actual fact, in his case, it's just brilliance, because he is brilliant.
I will also say,
think what people realize is that people just know that when he takes on a character, he will deliver it so brilliantly. So I
Well,
wondered what it was like to work with him in that scenario,
but he's not, it's not like he's in character all the time. Not at all. He will stay maybe in certain mannerisms because that's easier for him. Maybe the accent or stuff. I'm someone who's sort of I'm when the cameras aren't rolling, I would be too self-conscious to sort of stay in the accent. I prefer to just switch it on and off. But I think the thing to know as an actor is that it's whatever works best for you. Because one thing I'll say about that film, which was really interesting to watch, is Christian has his very kind of set process, and then Matt is much more easygoing and you know laughing and sort of joking around and talking, and then when action is called, Matt is like that. And I don't think either of them sort of reach a different end goal. They just have two very different processes because they're two very different people. And I think that that's the thing, if you're a young actor, is you don't have to torture yourself, or you don't have to sort of build up all of these circumstances around you, unless that's the only thing that gives you confidence.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about. It's just finding the way that you can show up on that moment when they say action with confidence and free and able to deliver.
Yeah. Absolutely, well said, really. So let's talk about Belfast. That's the film of the moment. It's received 7 Golden Globe nominations. You've received a Golden Globe nomination as well for Best Supporting Actress, and Ruth Negga obviously as well for The Changing. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful, number one, to see Irish actresses doing so well internationally. So thank you for being part of that troupe. We're all behind you all the way, and it's so inspiring for younger actors here at home in Ireland. But yes, let's talk about Belfast. I suppose it's Kenneth Branagh's. It's shot in black and white. It's his most personal film, and it's based on his childhood growing up in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and it revolves around a young boy called Buddy growing up in Belfast, and set in 1969 in the civil unrest, which we call the Troubles. And you play Buddy's mom, raising 2 sons, and your husband is the very one and only Jamie Dornan playing Pa, which is a fresh kind of role for him as well. But he commutes to London to work, and you're left raising the boys in this particular environment. And the granny and grandpa are played by Kieran Hines and Judi Dench. It's a fantastic lineup of actors. And even young Mr. Hill as well. And he's just absolutely fantastic. But so when your agent called you about the script, I know that you were in lockdown, you were in Glasgow, you were in the apartment for a number of months, and you were blown away when you saw the script and you said yes, you wanted to do it immediately. And for you thought, actually, oh my God, I'm going to get to work in Ireland. I've just been waiting to go back and work in Ireland, do a film in Ireland. And lo and behold, you wound up being in Surrey, in London. Well, that was obviously, they chose Surrey. Obviously there were strict COVID regulations. They were able to reconstruct the street in Belfast in Surrey. But so tell us, why did the script resonate with you from the outset?
Oh, wow. I mean, it was so beautifully written, but it was about, there's a couple of things. It was about family, which I think in that time we were all missing family. And, that was anything you read that sort of like opens that, part of your heart and talks about, missing family or leaving family. It's sort of like, oh, but it was a lot about leaving a place as well. And that's, I really understood personally, obviously very different circumstances, but having left Ireland at 17 and never having really returned, or 18, sorry, it's, it pulled on a lot of my own emotional experiences. I grew up right on the border. I didn't obviously have the experience of growing up in Belfast and not having that kind of immediate experience, but growing up on the border when it was very heated, I suppose, in the 80s and 90s, you know, you're so aware of everything that's going on in the north, and it's such a part of, the sort of background of your life. And my dad being a Garda sergeant and working on the border for so many years, you know I'd also never really read a script that focused just on a family about that wasn't really about the ideology. And there's such a place for those films, but also, you know at a certain point, you don't want to, at least for me, I never want to do something that's sort of glorifying the violence or glorifying certain elements of the troubles and stuff like that. So it was just such a gorgeous script. It just spoke to me in many different ways, and I just felt like I recognized Ma. There was a lot of my mum in there. I just She's just kind of, I don't know, felt like a lot of Irish women that I knew and miss, and sort of, I guess it was just, yeah, it was just spoke to me in a lot of ways.
Fantastic, fantastic. And I understand that you and the other cast members, you all did quite a bit of research, into the complexity, and as you said, a story about a family living during that time in those circumstances. So you did a lot of research and kind of looking up stuff on YouTube and news reports from the 1960s, and you binge watched BBC series, Pop Goes Northern Ireland, and a whole bunch of other things. And so tell us a little bit about what you learned and how you brought that to bear on your role as Ma, and how important that was.
Well, I'm very lucky because there's such a wealth of information from that time. There's actual footage from, those days on those streets where, the barricades are going up. There's a group of people from one side down here, and there's a group of people from another side up here. And there's a British soldier walking back and forth, trying to negotiate between them. And they were arguing over maybe 20 feet, so that a woman could get to her front door without having to go through the barricades. And, it all made me really sad, like really emotional and really sad, listening to all of this and listening to all of these testimonies of women and interviews with women. Just, how that was allowed to happen, and how that many lives have been allowed to be destroyed over the last how many years. I just think it's so tragic. It's been so tragic. And, the hatred that was stoked up, and the families that were destroyed, and all of those things, it's heartbreaking. It breaks, I think, you don't have to be from Belfast or Northern Ireland or Ireland, but I think because we're all from those various different places, it's heartbreaking. It's really tragic. And I think that was one of the things that, struck me the most. I was just, and maybe it was lockdown as well, but I remember I would be watching these things, I'd be sobbing on my computer, and like my husband would come by and he'd be like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "I'm fine," just,
Oh God. Yeah.
And also, but the flip side of that is also, at times it was hilarious. It was also like, I don't know, it's just the humor that's in people in Northern Ireland, the kind of black comedy of watching this, British soldier literally just going up and down, exasperated because he's just like, I don't know what to say,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's
well, in that you're right in one sense, because for all of us, and I don't know if you've gotten to see much of Derry Girls, for example.
Love.
Brilliant and TV comedy, and it's drama, but really depicting what it was like up north at the time. These youngsters again who just didn't care about the politics; they just wanted to get on with their lives. And in a sense, it's that exaggerated in this black humor and black comedy and so forth. And it was almost the only way to look at it at the time. Can't get over the bridge because the bomb's going to go off, and oh, for God's sake, I've got my hair appointment, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And
but
so
I do
all
think,
of that.
Irish people in general, we do deal with a lot of things with humor, and dark humor quite often. And that was one of the beautiful things of the script. I mean, there's so many things in it which are just really funny. And you kind of, as much as it deals with sort of partially a heavy subject, the film is also very joyous and sort of leaves you very buoyant. And I think that was the other thing you sort of.
And Kenneth Branagh was really terrific in doing that, in bringing out the poignancy of what was happening in the heart of that family, in between the Ma and Pa, in terms of, it looked like you guys were going to be torn apart and that you would not survive it. And this youngster trying to figure out, are they Protestants? Are they Catholics? And pointing out, a young child pointing out the confusing elements of even names and all of this kind. But Kenneth Branagh was brilliant, even from the outset. He brought you guys together at the start when you were doing all of the cast, the 4 of you, 5 of you, and sat you around a table and actually started asking you questions about your own lives and thinking about your own mothers and fathers growing up. And I guess a lot of you have connections with the North, and so you were able to draw upon that. But before you knew it, you were all sharing some of your personal backgrounds, and I think that was very effective. Obviously, can you tell us a little bit about what effect that had on you in terms of working together as an ensemble cast then?
Yeah, well, I mean, Ken is obviously incredibly intelligent and knows what he's doing at every moment. And I think he had this, brilliant idea. And if there's any young directors, these are the kind of things that make such a difference. If you're able to get a day or something like that with your cast, he got us in a room. It was Judy, Ciarán, Jamie, and myself. And he just wanted us all to talk and share. And, I definitely felt very intimidated walking into that room. Obviously Judi Dench is Judi Dench, and probably one of the greatest living actresses ever. And Ciarán, he's just so incredible. And Jamie is somebody that's, amazing and done so much amazing work and stuff. So I felt like the sort of, least experienced kid on the block. And I think one of the great things about that day, what it did for me at least, you go into this room and Judi Dench stops being Judi Dench and she starts being, little Judy when she tells a story about her childhood, and you sort of see her in that respect. And the same with Ciarán, and we all just shared. And I think it's a great leveler, it's a great bonder, something that bonds everyone together when you share sometimes very personal stuff, or things about your family and things that you've gone through. But also I think what Ken was doing in that was he would sort of give scenarios, and like, what would you have done as a kid with this, or what would your parents have done with that, and did you guys ever have this thing? And what he was really doing was getting us to sort of think about the certain subjects in the film, or the scenarios in the film in our own personal way, and connect to it in a personal way. And we would probably have done some of that work ourselves anyway, but in that shared way, we all sort of then knew what each other sort of was going to bring in. But it didn't feel as crafted, or as there's a word and it's not coming to me, but anyway, it was a very subtle way of doing it. Contrived. That's exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. But it was just really, really brilliant. And I'm conscious there's a load of questions coming in, and I'm as you were speaking, I glanced, but I can't see which lady it was now that asked about that. In terms, I was trying to see a question that fitted into what we were talking about right now. Somebody did say that let me have a wee look about the fact that they saw something that you mentioned about doing some improvisation with some of the cast and with Judi Dench, as you mentioned, Judi Dench, especially you being in awe of Judi Dench, and that you did some improv and on some of the script lines and all. Did some of that land? Did it wind up in the film?
Yeah, Ken quite often would get us to do little bits of improv, either running into scenes or, there's one in particular that he talks about quite a bit where little Jude has to sort of, the scene starts with him having this outburst about not wanting to leave Belfast. And, for him, for a kid at that age, it's sort of hard to kind of hit that, cold. So Jamie and I just sort of improv how we would break this news to him that we were thinking about moving and all of that kind of stuff. And Judy and I, there's a scene in the house where we're talking. It's the scene where she talks about her friend who had a curry, and she was running to the toilet for a week. And I'm not sure, I can't remember if that was a scripted line or if that was one of her lines, but that was the sort of scene we were improving a lot, and about what had happened the night before and about the boys, and it's great. But the one thing I would say, once you start working with somebody, any of those things that you put people on or not, they all disappear. They have to disappear. I think it's important that, you sort of you leave those behind once you start working, because otherwise, it wouldn't be good.
It wouldn't be good. It wouldn't be good. And obviously music, the music from that era was an integral part of this film, and it was so uplifting and so forth. And the dancing that you and Jamie did was just absolutely fantastic. But Van Morrison, who we all love so much, and so his music was central, a central component throughout the film, actually. And he's rightly been nominated as well for a Golden Globe for Best Song. So were you aware during the filming that Van's music would play this central role in the film, and how important was that music in bringing joy, that joy that you talked about, to the film, and lifting everybody's spirits?
Yeah, I mean, in the script, there is quite a bit of music. So we knew some of the songs that were already going to be in it. And in fact, there was, Jamie's singing Everlasting Love. There was a few more musical numbers. Ken has spoken about it a little bit, so I think it's okay to say. But I think in the end, he realized that it was sort of superfluous, and it was just better to have this one really beautiful, sort of joyous moment that was needed. But music's so important. Ken sent us a playlist of a couple of songs early on. He sent us a sizzle reel of a couple of clips of different films that he sort of wanted us to, get a sense of the tone of what he was going for. And he sent us quite a bit of music. And that, to me, I mean, me personally, I use music a lot in my work. I generally will create a playlist for my characters. And I think it's such a telling thing about what somebody listens to, what somebody reads, and what somebody watches. And if I'm doing a period piece, I'll generally try and fill in those couple of things for my character, because I think that sort of tells you a lot about who they are. So yeah, there was a lot. I mean, it's great. It's a great era for music. So it was just there's a couple of songs as well. My poor husband is like, I never want to hear that song again, because I would just play them over and over and over in the house.
Very good.
But
Very
yeah, Van is amazing.
Oh, he's so cool. But and obviously just gave that really fantastic texture to the film overall. But I remember reading something that you were talking about independent filmmaking as well, and I think that's really important when it comes to this film in Belfast, because you and like so many actors, you said you appreciate the opportunity to work on independent film, because it kind of offers that freedom of expression for filmmakers, and they don't have to kind of go through that whole micromanaging that comes with a lot of studio based films and budgets and all this kind of thing. And you said that if Kenneth had made Belfast under a studio situation, they would have demanded that he'd have to explain, the conflict between the unionists who wanted Northern Ireland to remain in the UK and the nationals who fought, for United Ireland, and that would have really brought down, kind of really slowed up everything and made the whole thing so complex, when in actual fact, so tell us a little bit about that independence and that freedom of expression for Branagh that allowed him tell his story so well, free from this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Ken made this on his own, and sort of it was brought to people as a finished product. And so he very much was able to tell the story he wanted to tell in the way he was going to tell it. And that goes to, how it was going to look, how the story, all of these things. And I think it's a luxury not everybody has, but it's, I don't think he would have been able to make that under a studio system. I think they would have wanted far too many things explained and to fill in all the blanks. And, you hear sometimes people are like, but, they don't really talk about what the troubles really are. And it's like, but it's about a kid, really. It's about the eyes of a kid. The kid doesn't really know what the troubles are and doesn't really care. He's more concerned about his football, his grandparents, and the girl that he's trying to get sitting next to in class. But I think, that's the beauty of independent film, is that you get a singular voice who gets to tell a specific story that has meaning to them. And, what we've discovered in promoting this film and bringing it everywhere, that in the specificity, there is a universality in a weird way. If you make something that's very much in the micro, our lives, us as people, we're all very similar when you break it down. The basic things that we need are very similar. So everybody can sort of see themselves in this story, because everybody's had grandparents, everybody's had a loss of innocence, everybody's had their first crush, these very universal things. That's what resonates with people. But like, if we'd started sort of putting it in context and framing it within the larger framework of what was going on at the time, you would lose that purity of the simple message. And then, I don't think it would have been as successful as a storytelling device.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure for a lot of people, a lot of us, when you see the word Belfast and there's a film about Belfast, you take a gasp, because it's always been either from one side's perspective or another. And he brilliantly tells the story, and delivers it so well. You all deliver it so well. Obviously the film was filmed in black and white and edited so beautifully as well. And don't know
Amazing.
who is she's our IFTA winner, and she's a BAFTA winner, and she's just a superb human being as well, just so creative and really so professional, not unlike yourself. And obviously she helped Kenneth so well to bring his vision onto the screen. So what is it for you about being Irish and working as you do around the world that excites you?
Oh, wow. Well, I think, God, we have somehow earned ourselves a lot of goodwill around the world. I think there's pretty much nowhere you go that you don't say where you're from, and it doesn't sort of light people's face up with a smile and they have some sort of story about Ireland, or, there's something that just disarms people about saying you're Irish, which is really lovely. It's a great conversation starter. It's a great barrier breaker, I suppose. But the beauty of working on this film was the fact that there was so many Irish people. I mean, most of our cast were Irish. I think it's probably about 80%, and it was just such a lovely environment. I think I've been very lucky. I think Scottish people have a similar sort of sense about them, but there was just no ego with anyone with their work. And I think that that's the great thing. It's like we all, I think we're really hard workers, but we take our work seriously, but we don't necessarily take ourselves too seriously, which is a really lovely thing, because we're also there to enjoy ourselves and have a bit of fun too.
Yeah. Well, it's great, and it's great to see that cohort of strong Irish females out there, in the international circuit as well. It's brilliant. And Branagh obviously speaks very highly of you as an actor, and he said I think one of his quotes was kind of the combination of passion, intelligence, humor, generosity. All, I know you're going to cringe now with the
I
sound
paid
of all
him
of,
for that. No.
of all of that, but he said that that's the kind of soul that you bring to bear. But he's also aware of the fact that you're interested, and your ability to go behind the camera in terms of producing and directing your own work and your own projects in the future. And he said, that from the experience you've had across 6 seasons of Outlander, which is a hell of a lot of training. It's a massive training ground from a technical point of view alone, in terms of the whole filming side of things that you've been exposed to. So tell us, like, have you? Well, I know that you've recently optioned that novel. Here is the Beehive, isn't it? By Sarah Crossan, and you want to obviously develop that into a feature film in the future at some stage. But how important is it for you to be part of developing your own projects in the future and going behind the camera? And for women in general, I suppose, to create their own destinies, tell their own stories on screen. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, again, it sort of goes back to sort of what we were saying about having someone be able to tell a story the way they want to. I think as an actor, sometimes you're at the mercy of what comes your way, and who gets to write stuff, who gets to direct stuff, how do these stories get told. I mean, I think we're in a really brilliant time right now. We see it with Rebecca Hall's passing that Ruth is in, or Maggie Gyllenhaal's The Lost Daughter that Jessie Buckley's in. These are amazing actresses who've gone behind the camera, and they're telling stories from a female perspective, and they're resonating really deeply with people, because I don't think in the past we haven't had enough of that. I would love to direct. There's no secret about that. It's a matter of when. Hopefully. I just think you have to be a bit of a master of your own destiny in this business. There's always going to be dips and lulls, and especially for women. And I think if you have a family as well, that will play into your ability to sort of sign on and travel and do things sort of under the mercy of somebody else. And I think if you can control your own destiny a little bit, then you can maybe make things like that work a little bit better for you. I don't know. I think the industry is changing a lot. It's opening up. It's making space for people that have traditionally not had space for them. And that can only be a good thing. And I think, the more we get diverse stories, the more as a society as well, hopefully we'll learn and be nicer to each other and understand each other a little bit better. So
absolutely. And before I go to some of the questions that are coming in, and I'm sorry I'm gone a little over time there, but just a couple of key questions just for, again, young filmmakers, young actors that are listening in. What is the best piece of advice that you have been given as an actor? Simple.
Oh God. Don't force anything. The worst thing I think is when you see in a script and it says, and then she cries or something, and then you see people really trying to cry, and it's like, I wish writers would never write that. It's like, feel the sadness or feel the whatever, but you don't have to express it in tears. Or even with anything, with anger doesn't have to come out in a big loud shout, all of those things. I think that was a real aha moment, when somebody, I don't know, was probably an acting coach way back when, just gives you that. If you're not feeling it organically, if it's not coming to you organically, don't force it, because it will always, you know, the audience will read the fakeness in that.
Yeah.
What
No,
about-
you're very good. Very good.
And I don't know if that's good advice, but anyway, that's what
Yeah, no, and in terms of you know, advice in terms of new actors struggling to get a role, you know, or even an audition, you know, it's
it's hard. Well, the auditions, I would say, you know, find out how, you know, if it's, I'm not sure what happens in Ireland, but you know, there's bound to be, it used to be Backstage was the magazine in the US. I know Spotlight in the UK, breakdowns. Find out where the auditions are being posted. You know, write letters or submit your details. Find out who the casting directors are. Find out who the agents are. Find out who the managers are. You know, we are in the age of Google. It's all there for you to find. Do your work, you know, get into your classes. I don't know, and be part of student films. That's always a really good way of getting into things. You know, find out which colleges or universities have got great film programs. Stalk the people who are in them. You know, try and get a part, but also create your own stuff. You know, everybody now has an iPhone, you know, computer. You can make the most amazing stuff on iPhones. You know, there's films, I'm blanking on his name now, but Tangerine is a great film that was made on an iPhone. um you know, you can create, and I think that that's what you have to do. If you're sitting around waiting for someone to give you the opportunity, you're going to be sitting around for a while. So
yeah, very good. I'm just going to pick up a couple of questions like Sacy, I think her name is. She's saying when you're acting and you're thinking, you know, about specific gestures, movements, expressions, and so forth, to round out, you know, is that important to round out a convincing performance? She's saying.
um I don't think you're thinking about what you're doing. I think you're thinking about what you're feeling. I think that's all. The rest comes if you're feeling the right thing. If you're sort of put yourself in the shoes of your character and you're really feeling what that character is feeling in the moment, then everything else just sort of comes. That's, yeah, you can't really think about what your face is doing or what any of the other stuff.
Yes. Courtney, then there's a couple of questions about the fact that you've optioned Beehive. Here's the Beehive. And so Courtney's saying, we've seen your desire to produce and direct. How did you decide on Here's the Beehive as a choice for future project? And FYI, an incredible choice.
Oh, good.
And other people are saying the same thing.
Yeah, it's really bad that it's out there, because everyone's like, what's happening? It's like, well, it takes a long time to develop things. How did I decide? I read it and I just loved it. And I you know, it was one of those things. I straight away emailed somebody and was like, do you think we could see if this is available? And if it is, can we start up a conversation? And it was, and we optioned it. But yeah, it just, the story spoke to me. Sarah's writing is incredible. Yeah.
Very good. And Susan here is saying Belfast is a gem with universal themes. Do you think it may last in the film world and among viewers to return to for its confirmation of values that are fundamental to the best in humankind? Question mark. P.S. It's a wonderful performance. Caitríona, thank you.
Oh, that's lovely.
Very nice.
I would hope so. You know, I think unfortunately because of COVID, it's not really having the life that maybe I would hope it would have had in the cinemas. So I hope it has a life beyond this, and it's a movie that people will watch, you know, over and over. Be nice.
Very good. And Sabrina is saying, if Caitríona could direct any actor, I know this is a tough question to ask you, who would you love to direct?
Ooh, it's a good question. I mean, probably Kate Winslet.
Very good.
She's kind of incredible. That would be lovely to direct her.
Very good, very good. Does Caitríona, this is from Chloe Ahern, does Caitríona have any advice for upcoming Irish actors and actresses in terms of is a move out of Ireland required to become successful?
I don't think so. I think there's quite a lot of successful Irish actors, I mean, who live in Ireland still. And there's an amazing industry in Ireland. And, you know, I am thinking of Sarah Green right now, who works a lot in Ireland doing amazing Irish projects, and she's incredible. No, I don't think so. I think nowadays anyway, you can, you know, I'm sure all the agents in Ireland get the casting breakdowns for projects that are filming everywhere. You know, you can kind of send a tape in anywhere. That's one of the great things now about people doing taped auditions. But I don't know.
Yeah.
My experience is that I left, but I think there's a lot of people who do really well who didn't.
Yeah. It's a tough question, because obviously, you know, our industry is really growing here in Ireland, and there's really great opportunities here now as well. And obviously for us as an academy, we can see that year on year growing. But I suppose there's nothing like getting experience abroad. Sometimes, you know, the way you were talking about us Irish, you know, we've got this insecurity anyway, and we've got this sense of if you don't go away and make it abroad, then you're not going to make it, you know. But I think things have changed.
I mean, look, I one of the people I work with, who's one of my dear friends, and I love her to bits, Maria Doyle Kennedy. You know, she's an incredible actress, and she works all the time. But she lives in Ireland, and she never left. But she does projects that are outside of Ireland because she's, you know, she's an incredible actress. But you know, that wasn't because she went off, I think.
Well, she did go to Spain now for a while. She's lived a little bit.
Well, then I stand corrected.
Okay, but that's okay. But there's another Chloe, or was that Chloe? Christina says, so you want to work in Ireland in the future? Have you anything in mind? All I can say is that now that people know that you're open to working in Ireland, and especially because of the Belfast scenario, and so I think you're going to get an awful lot of offers from really brilliant. There's some brilliant Irish filmmakers out there, great projects and so forth. But this is obviously something you'd like to do, and
I would love
has
to.
anything happened so far?
Yeah, no, I would love to. There's one or two things recently that sort of came my way, but it's just more of a scheduling issue at the moment, because I'm obviously going back to Outlander soon. I read some really great scripts actually, but you know, I think stars have to align for all these things. But I think after the next season, if I have a little bit of time, maybe that's where it'll be.
Anna Carolina, and she's also got a bit of a Spanish name, which maybe Italian, Lorenzo. What is your dream role, and what do you hope to do in the future when you grow up? I'm not saying she didn't say that part. And who would you love to work with that you haven't had the opportunity to work with already?
Oh God, I mean, there's so many people. I've only done 3, well, you know, proper speaking roles in films, I would say. I mean, with the future, I just want to have a long, interesting career. I guess that's the kind of dream, you know, be able to do many different things. And you know, there's so many people I want to work with, but there's also so many people that I've probably never even heard of that I'll be delighted to work with in the future. I think you just have to keep open. You know, I think you never know what's going to come across your way. I don't know what that is, but yeah, we'll see.
Not that we've touched on that, but I'll mention this in terms of Outlander, and it talks about the intimate scenes in Outlander, which we didn't go into, and I just but it's Victoria Shepherd says, read the many intimate scenes in Outlander. How much blocking do you work out with Sam, and how much is set out in the script with the directors and the directions in terms of the vision for the piece? How does working with an intimacy director affect or change the organic creation of the work? It's a very good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Last season was the first season we have worked with an intimacy coordinator, Vanessa Coffey, who's amazing. You know, you do a lot of blocking. I think season one, we were obviously very young and naive and I'd never done scenes like that before. Neither had Sam or Tobias, weirdly. And so we were all sort of muddling our way through. Um, and there's a learning curve, I think, that happens with, you know, what you're sort of doing in a room, and then you see it and you're like, oh God, there's a lot more on show maybe than we would realized. And a lot of that has to do with, you will block a scene, but in the beginning, I don't think we always knew exactly where the cameras were going to be and how much the cameras were going to see and things like that. So you know it's good to have an intimacy coordinator, because that person sort of takes over a lot of the responsibility of that, whereas as an you don't then, as an actor, have to worry about those things, because it can be, you know you want to give the most honest performance, so you don't want to be thinking about things like that when you're in these scenes, but at the same time you have to protect yourself. So it's a very strange thing to sort of do. um but I don't think it changes it. I don't think it changes the essence of it. I think, if anything, having the intimacy coordinator there allows you to be freer, because you're not worried about, are they going to show something I don't want them to show? Is it going to be portrayed in a way that I'm not comfortable with? You've those parameters have already been set, so you can actually, in the scene, sort of relax a bit. So I think it's actually a great thing.
And I think for us here in Ireland, and especially the Irish audience and international audiences as well, with normal people, that actually was so successful here.
Great show.
Yeah, a great film, a great drama, and we very much, wouldn't say from the Academy's point of view, looked at the whole intimacy coordinator in terms of the planning around that, the brilliant cinematographers, all of what's involved, and it's a big part of it, and it's really technical, and it's brilliant when you achieve it so well, and obviously you guys did in Outlander as well. So Sandy Mullins says, as a second wave feminist with experience of being a feminist organizer in the entertainment community in the late 1970s and 80s, I want to thank you for your feminism, both on screen and off. How have you had the courage and the finesse in the 21st century to do this in the entertainment industry?
Well, I thank you, but I don't know that I am very courageous or anything. I think we just live in a great time where a lot of the wrongs are starting to be righted, but not no battle is ever won indefinitely, as we're seeing in the US. A lot of these things that were fought for and achieved are now being rolled back in a lot of places, which is really sad. But I think, I'm a citizen of the world. I think some people think if you're an actor, you should just shut up and do your job. But I think it's a responsibility of everybody to use their voice and to try and shine a light on things that are important.
Absolutely. Well said. And Velasquez says, after now almost 2 years of the pandemic, can you name maybe 3 positive things that you can take out of this crazy time?
Well, I personally, I've had a lovely thing that I can take out of this pandemic. I obviously had my baby, but I think people have become a lot more thoughtful, I think, about, well, at least it felt like people were a lot more thoughtful about how they use their time. I think that's been a big thing that people have sort of discovered. I think, I don't know, we were being a lot more thoughtful about our environment, I feel like, in the beginning. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but I would like to think that people are thinking more like that.
Hi guys.
That means time's up. Well, before I say the one thing, thank you, Gar, that just to let people know, and Caitríona, thank you so much. But before we finish up, I want to say about season 7. The scripts are in for you, and you're reading through that, and it's going to be the biggest season ever, I believe. So obviously for you in the future, that's going to be a whole year of your life upcoming.
Yeah, it'll be sort of like season 1 again. We did a year then, we're going to do another year. It'll be intense. It'll be, I'm definitely trying to figure out how we're going to manage a whole year of it. But it'll be great. I think I'm excited from the few scripts I've seen so far. They're really strong, and I think it'll be really good.
Caitríona, all I can say is thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time and really insightful and helpful in terms of sound bites for people and guidance and so forth, but also just to share your story, and we really appreciate it. But above all, congratulations on the ongoing brilliant work that you're doing, and long may that continue, and best of luck in the awards season now. And obviously we'll be delighted to talk to you again very soon from IFTA's point of view and in terms of Belfast. But thank you so much for
Thank you so much, Anya. My pleasure. Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. Gar, do you want to come back on? We'll just say goodbye here, Caitríona.
Okay. All right. Thank you
so much.
Bye. Thanks, Anya.
Bye. Bye. Bye.